So there's an act. We know implementation of law is a problem in this context. We know there's a problem with. So what is the reality and how, you've talked about risks. I think I'm talking about how do we implement, because civil society are transiting. I think the deadline is this coming month.
Yeah,
so we are now going to be under the PBO Act. What is the prognosis for the Act coming into force and these ambitions being realized?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's useful, first of all, to just put in context what is the sector, right? So the NGO sector, at the moment we don't have reliable figures on public benefits organizations generally, because there are too many regimes and too many organizations that are not being documented well. And this is part of the power of the PBO Act, and it's also the danger when it comes to the mass surveillance and abuse of executive office. But what we know from the NGO sector is that something like 9,000 out of 14,000 NGOs are still very active. And they produce something like about 246 billion shillings in revenue every year. That's an employment, bracket of about 70,000 Kenyans. Much of the funding goes into health and into, responding to displacement, forced migration, and conflict-related issues. And of course, much of it is anti-poverty. The governance sector and the human rights sector is actually very small, right, financially, and also in terms of numerically the number of organizations, at least according to last year's 2025 bill. So I think this is the context that we are kind of always thinking about. The dangers of political capture are real. Right, they are somewhat. The PBO Act is a better act to fight against political capture than the NGO Coordination Act, the act that we are migrating from, because that was a one-party state act. It did not essentially put in any safeguards. And I've mentioned the tribunal. I've mentioned the independent. Faith has mentioned the independent PBO authority. So there are a number of levers within the act that actually prohibit political capture, and it's really important that the political elites and the authoritarians that seem to traverse our state offices, that they must step back and allow this sector to be able to breathe and to do what it does best, which is to hold the state accountable and to also create civic education. I remember, over the last two elections, 2017 and 2022, having very intense conversations with senior officers from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when they had essentially issued note verbals to the donor community just before the elections, that the donor community must not fund civic education, and they must not fund civic education by NGOs or by the IABC. And the dangers were clear to me back then, which is essentially if you have a populace that is not educated on its rights or its ability to vote and has no inspiration from the political class, they will exit the exercise we call elections.
Right.
And what you will have is a disenfranchisement of large numbers of young people who are extremely powerful, potentially. Now, what we saw break out in the streets in 2024 and 2025 was a young population whose patience had just snapped. Now, the same thing could happen as we go into these elections. If the state tries to control our right to funding and our right to seek funding from wherever it is, we have an obligation to report. That is acceptable. But the state does not have the right to block us from accessing either international finance or